Bienvenue à tous pour cette session qui va être consacrée à la dimension européenne du partenariat pour un gouvernement ouvert sous le titre An Agenda for the EU. C'est une dimension qu'il est bien naturel d'aborder puisque l'Union européenne a une forme de gouvernance particulière qui ne procède pas, dans laquelle la légitimité ne procède pas de l'élection. Et donc la question des processus de gouvernance, la question de tout ce qu'on met derrière l'ouverture est particulièrement importante pour l'Union européenne. Et ça renvoie à des questions comme la prévention des conflits d'intérêts, comme la transparence, l'ouverture des données. Ça renvoie aussi à la question de l'association de la société civile et des citoyens au processus d'élaboration, de préparation des décisions. Donc, tout thème qu'il est important et naturel de discuter ici. Alors, je suis Jean Pisani-Ferry, je suis commissaire général de France Stratégie. Émilie Oreilly est médiatrice européenne et Daniel Lebègue est président de Transparency International France. Donc nous sommes assez qualifiés pour en parler devant vous, c'est pour ça que nous sommes là, mais vous pourriez dire qu'il manque quelqu'un, et qu'il manque quelqu'un qui représente la Commission européenne. La Commission européenne n'est pas membre de l'OGP, donc elle n'a pas souhaité, bien que je l'ai invitée, participer à cette rencontre. Nous aurons l'occasion de parler donc des processus qui sont mis en œuvre par la Commission en l'absence de la Commission. C'est un peu regrettable, mais c'est comme ça. Donc je vais donner peut-être d'abord la parole très très brièvement à nos deux participants pour qu'ils disent un peu quel est leur rôle. Émilie Oreilly, peut-être d'abord, what's the role of the, what you call the European Ombudsman, not woman, actually?
Yes, the Swedish are very proud of having created the institution of the Ombudsman 200 years ago, and they believe that Ombudsman applies to both genders, but of course I answer to Ombudswoman as well, and in France, Mediatrice, and Spanish-speaking countries, Defensora del Pueblo. As EU Ombudsman, I act like any member state ombudsman. I take complaints from members of the public, from NGOs, from businesses, in relation to allegations of poor behaviour or maladministration from any of the European Union institutions. So the Commission, because of its role, obviously is our biggest client, our biggest customer, but we also have complaints about all of the bodies and agencies throughout the European Union. For example, the European Central Bank, the European Investment Bank, the European Medicines Agencies, all of the many institutions and bodies. So I act like most ombudsmen. I listen to what the complainant has to say. I ask the institutions for a report. And then at the end of my investigation, I make a recommendation in relation to it.
Thank you very much. Daniel Lebègue.
C'est peut-être pas nécessaire de présenter longuement Transparency International. On a l'habitude de dire, mais on essaie de le démontrer, que nous sommes, dans la société civile, la principale organisation qui agit pour la transparence et l'intégrité dans la vie publique, dans l'économie et dans la société. Une ONG présente dans 110 pays dans le monde, et pour cette conférence à Paris, 45 de nos collègues participent à des débats, tables rondes, représentant plus de 20 pays des 5 continents. Voilà.
Impressionnant. Bien, pour cette discussion, ce que je vous propose, c'est que nous traitions 3 questions, qui ne sont pas petites, mais qui sont délimitées, et une grande. Les 3 questions sont la question des conflits d'intérêts dans l'Union européenne, la question de la transparence et la question de l'association des citoyens au fonctionnement de l'Union. La grande question qu'il faut aussi traiter, c'est la question de savoir si, par rapport à la situation politique que nous connaissons dans l'Union, avec une défiance à l'égard des institutions de l'Union qui s'est exprimée très fort dans le cas du Royaume-Uni, mais qui s'exprime sous d'autres formes dans un certain nombre d'autres pays. Est-ce que le gouvernement ouvert est une partie de la réponse à cette grande question ou pas, ou dans quelle mesure est-ce que c'est une partie de la réponse à cette question? Voilà, donc démarrons tout de suite. Je permettrai bien sûr qu'il y ait des questions. Je vous suggère, si vous le souhaitez, de vous exprimer, de poser des questions ou d'indiquer des préoccupations, des réactions sur Twitter avec le hashtag OGPEU, hein, OGPEU. Si vous donnez le hashtag d'abord, et ça permettra immédiatement donc d'avoir les questions qui peuvent se poser, et nos amis qui sont là pourront les mentionner. Bien, sur le premier point, peut-être d'abord Emilie O'Reilly sur les conflits d'intérêts.
Well, conflicts of interest is a subject, an issue that I deal with quite a lot in terms of the complaints that I get from citizens, NGOs and so on, and also some of my own initiative investigations that I do where I suspect that there may be maladministration occurring. I think I should say that in general the EU institutions, sometimes their conflict of interest rules are stronger and better and more coherent than those in some member states, but I still think it has some work to do. I deal with conflicts of interest on a number of levels. I deal with them in relation to EU officials, also EU commissioners, and I also deal with it on the level of some of the agencies or other bodies. For example, let's say allegations of conflicts of interest in relation to the Food Safety Authority or the European Medicines Agency and so on. So it covers quite a wide range. But talking about in relation to the staff, I think generally the rules are quite strong, and following an investigation that I did some years ago, the EU Commission now publishes online on its website details of senior officials who have left the public service and who are now entering the private sector. And what you get is their name, the role that they played in the particular DG, the Commission section that they worked for, where they are going, and what restrictions, if any, have been placed on them in relation to lobbying their former colleagues and so on. So generally that works quite well. I would prefer that the Commission would publish more often than annually, but all of these things tend to be evolutions and not revolutions, so hopefully in the years to come that'll change. However, on the political level, I think to some extent it's more serious, and I intervened a few months ago in relation to a case which I'm sure all of you here are aware of, and that concerns the decision by the former European Commission President, Mr. Barroso, to join Goldman Sachs Bank at a very high level. Initially, the Commission said that he hadn't broken any rules. He had observed what's known as the period of 18 months, the cooling off period, and had announced his intention to join the bank about a month or so after that. However, there was an unusually high amount, I would say, of negative reaction to that, which was actually from civil society.
Yeah, but across the EU?
Across the EU, yeah, across the EU. It was also something that was picked up in the US as well. The staff of the institutions themselves were very angry about it, and they actually launched a petition which received quite a number of signatures. And at the beginning of September, I wrote to President Juncker pointing out the concern that there had been in relation to this and suggesting that he should ask the Ethics Committee, which advises the Commission on these sort of matters, to take a look at the appointment of Mr. Barroso. They essentially said that he hadn't broken any rules, but I'm still waiting for the Commission now to come back with their final account, shall we say, of their view of Mr. Barroso's move. Because just briefly, I think the problem with this was that it played into a populist agenda. And I remember when Mr. Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP and who was to the fore in relation to Brexit, when he had his intervention during the State of the Union address in the European Parliament some months ago, the first thing he did was to congratulate Mr. Barroso on his appointment. So I think it's not just a matter of the strict rules. I think you have to look at it in the wider dimension and to join the dots between incidents like that and wider issues of populism.
Thank you. Daniel?
En matière de prévention des conflits d'intérêts et d'encadrement du lobbying, c'est-à-dire les relations entre les groupes d'intérêts et les décideurs publics. Je dirais que l'Union européenne a fait la moitié du chemin et il lui reste l'autre moitié à faire. Elle a fait la moitié du chemin. Il y a, depuis 2014, une procédure de déclaration d'intérêt pour les commissaires, leurs conseillers. Il y a un code de conduite et il y a un comité éthique qui veille au respect des règles. Depuis 2014 également, on a institué à Bruxelles un registre des groupes d'intérêt, des lobbyistes. Bon, c'est un acquis incontestable, mais ça n'est que la moitié du chemin. D'abord, sur les conflits d'intérêts. On ne peut pas se limiter aux commissaires et à leurs équipes, à leurs conseillers. Le sujet concerne tous les acteurs publics de l'Union européenne. La Commission, les directeurs, mais aussi les parlementaires, et même le Conseil européen, la présidence et ses services. Deuxièmement, tous ces acteurs, comme c'est le cas en France aujourd'hui et dans d'autres pays de l'Union, tous ces acteurs devraient être tenus d'établir une déclaration d'intérêt et de patrimoine. Tous. En France, maintenant, 14 000 décideurs publics sont tenus de faire cette déclaration et, pour la plupart d'entre eux, les ministres, les parlementaires, de la rendre publique. On en est loin à Bruxelles. On en est loin. Troisièmement, pour ce qui est du lobbying, il y a un registre, c'est bien, sur lequel les groupes de pression, les groupes d'intérêt, décident de s'inscrire ou non. Pour rencontrer un commissaire, il faut être inscrit sur le registre. Mais en revanche, si on veut avoir un rendez-vous avec un directeur de la Commission, avec un parlementaire, on n'est pas tenu d'être inscrit sur le registre. C'est très insuffisant, très insuffisant. Nous plaidons pour un registre commun, exécutif, Parlement, administration européenne. Un registre obligatoire, c'est-à-dire que les décideurs publics n'acceptent de recevoir, de donner des rendez-vous qu'à des organisations ou des personnes inscrites sur le registre. Et troisièmement, sur ce registre, on doit trouver des informations utiles pour les citoyens, pour assurer la bonne information des citoyens. Les dates et l'objet des rencontres, les moyens que les lobbyistes consacrent à Bruxelles à leur action d'influence, qui est tout à fait respectable. Le lobbying n'a rien de condamnable ou de négatif. Simplement, il doit être transparent. On doit aussi, lorsque des groupes d'intérêt, quels qu'ils soient, y compris une ONG comme la nôtre, lorsqu'on dépose des propositions d'amendement à des textes au Parlement ou auprès de la Commission, on doit le signaler sur le registre. Tel amendement a pour origine telle organisation professionnelle. Voilà. Donc, on a mis en place quelques outils très insuffisants encore, et l'Union européenne devrait être exemplaire dans ce domaine, tant pour ce qui concerne les déclarations d'intérêt, de revenus, de patrimoine, que pour ce qui est des relations entre les décideurs publics européens et les groupes d'intérêt.
Merci. Quick reaction.
Yes, I should say, in fairness to the Commission, they have changed the Code of Conduct following the Mr Barroso issue to the cooling off period is now being lengthened both for former commissioners and for former commission presidents. In relation to the transparency register, the Commission has also made proposals to make it tougher. And to strengthen it. But in any of these things, it's very important that it is resourced properly and that it is monitored properly. Because it's one thing to just make an entry onto a website or a logbook or whatever. It's quite something else to make sure that these are followed up and scrutinised. And particularly that the funding of any of these groups or individual lobbies is known about. Because very often, as we know, they appear as organisations or front groups, and the actual identity or certainly the source of funding for some of them is not very clear. But I think a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last few years, I think it has as its core to allow the people of Europe to see how decisions are made, because it's a very, to most people it's very distant, it's very, it's oblique, it's difficult. And so a lot of the my own initiative investigations have been into, for example, the transparency of the trilogue process. And trilogues are the deal making between the Commission, the Parliament and the Council. I've also looked at the balance of expert groups. There are 800 plus expert groups that advise the Commission on all sorts of policy areas. And I know a lot of people in civil society, NGOs, who may not be obviously as well resourced as industry and big corporations and so on, struggle to take their seat on those expert groups so that the influencing is balanced appropriately in relation to them. So I think, when I look and see a sort of a common theme over that particular part of my work, it is about that. It's trying to help people to see how decision making is done at Brussels level and who is influencing whom and how.
We're into the transparency discussion. So perhaps two very specific questions. One on trade negotiations, because this has been a matter for public controversy recently with negotiation of the TTIP and what's called in France TAFTA, strangely enough. And second, with the proceeding of the Council. Should the Council have its sessions televised so that citizens can monitor as for any parliament, or is it right for the Council to be able to deliberate behind closed doors?
Well, I think in relation to the trade agreements, again, back in 2013 when I took office, I was aware that there was a lot of concern about what was seen to be a lack of transparency in relation to the US-EU trade negotiations, TTIP. And I did a public consultation on that and put several questions to the Commission, also inspected their own records and so on, which as Ombudsman I have the power to do, and then made a series of recommendations to them. And I think in fairness to Commissioner Malmström and to the Commission, they did react very positively to not just my recommendations, but the recommendations of civil society and indeed of the Parliament as well. And they did make things a lot more transparent. But I think what the Commission realised, I think the Commission was actually quite shocked by the level of engagement and interest in the TTIP negotiations. And I think they hadn't factored in social media in relation to it, the way that people can engage so directly in this. And I think in the middle, or even after the TTIP negotiations had begun, they had to completely overhaul their communication strategies to take that on board. In relation to the Council, again, this fits into the work I'm doing on trilogues and making more visible how that deal making is done. And I suppose that was probably the investigation that I got most resistance from initially, from the three institutions, because they felt that the Ombudsman was getting involved in political issues, which are not part of my mandate, and of course they're not. But I was able to convince them that what I was doing was simply allowing people, as is their right, to see lawmaking essentially done in public, and for them to be able to see, even historically after the event, how the decision was made and so on. I've made recommendations in relation to this, and I'm waiting very shortly. All of the institutions should come back with their answers to that. As to the extent of the transparency, obviously, in any good transparency regime, there has to be some space for the deliberative process. It's finding the point on the line that has to happen. That is very important. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that particular investigation.
I actually have a question on Twitter from Iveta Kazoka, if I pronounce well. Is there a way to make EU procedures, Trilogue Council, transparent without bringing EU decision-making to a standstill?
Dans une démocratie, le principe, c'est celui de la redevabilité de ceux qui exercent un mandat public. Article 15 de la Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. La société, en français, la société est en droit de demander compte à tout agent public de son administration. Redevabilité, accountability, c'est le principe. Et c'est aussi le principe de l'open government. Toutes les informations, toutes les décisions publiques, les archives publiques ont vocation à être accessibles aux citoyens. C'est le principe. Mais évidemment, ce principe supporte des exceptions. Tout le monde connaît ou imagine les contraintes de l'action publique. Il y a par exemple un secret des négociations diplomatiques. Il y a un secret de la défense et des questions liées à la sécurité. Et il y a même, dans le monde de l'entreprise, un secret industriel. Mais bien sûr, tous ces secrets doivent être respectés. Mais encore faut-il affirmer d'abord le principe de l'open government, de l'open data. Et de ce point de vue-là, si la Commission européenne décidait ce que nous espérons, de rejoindre l'Open Government Partnership, ça serait un signal très important. Elle aussi, au niveau des institutions, des acteurs publics, partagent ce principe de l'ouverture des données et de l'accès des données aux citoyens, qui est la règle, qui est le principe. Et ensuite, on définirait quelques exceptions à ce principe. Voilà. Donc, moi, j'attends beaucoup l'adhésion future de l'Union européenne et de la Commission en particulier à notre partenariat pour un gouvernement ouvert.
Sur les données, pour prendre la défense un instant de la Commission, je crois que la publication nominative des aides de la politique agricole commune n'a pas été l'initiative du gouvernement français, mais plutôt une initiative qui est venue de l'Union européenne, qui est venue de la pression dans certains États membres, hein, pour ce qui est de l'accès aux données.
Mais oui, mais il y a des réticences, aussi bien dans les États membres qu'à Bruxelles. Je ne conteste pas cela.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions à ce stade, en particulier sur ces sujets de transparence ou des interventions? Vous avez des micros devant vous, donc vous pouvez prendre la parole. Là-bas, oui. Monsieur, avec. It's coming.
Désolé pour ça. Juste, on parlait de transparence. Que pensez-vous, votre sentiment sur la directive Trade Secret?
Sur le secret des affaires.
Oui.
Alors, là, on est sur un sujet d'actualité de première importance. Si je peux développer une minute. De notre point de vue, le moment est venu à Bruxelles, pour la Commission, pour le Parlement et pour les États membres, de débattre et, si possible, de décider en commun sur 3 sujets qui sont intimement liés. Le secret des affaires, la protection des lanceurs d'alerte et, troisièmement, la liberté de la presse et des journalistes de faire de mener son travail d'investigation. On tourne autour de ces sujets à Bruxelles et à Strasbourg depuis 3 ans. Et on a beaucoup de mal à avancer. Il y a une directive sur le secret des affaires qui a été adoptée en principe, mais comme elle n'a pas traité ou elle a maltraité les 2 autres volets, le sujet reste là. Et en matière d'alerte citoyenne, de protection des lanceurs d'alerte, pour l'instant, il n'y a aucune initiative au niveau de l'Union européenne, ni la Commission, ni le Parlement. Nous appelons de nos voeux une initiative de ce type, une directive, une recommandation, qui fixe un cadre commun pour organiser, en particulier en Europe, la protection des lanceurs d'alerte. J'ajoute tout de suite, les lanceurs d'alerte de bonne foi, qui agissent de manière désintéressée et au service de l'intérêt général. On n'est pas là pour protéger les dénonciations entre collègues de travail ou entre voisins. Ça relève de la justice pénale. En revanche, le lanceur d'alerte qui agit au service du bien commun dans le domaine de la santé, dans le domaine de l'environnement, dans le domaine de la lutte contre la fraude, celui-là mérite d'être reconnu et protégé.
Merci. Emily.
Well, just in relation to whistleblowers, my involvement has just been in relation to the institutions and whether they have followed up their obligations under the new staff regulations to have whistleblowing policies in place, and following an investigation that I did, all of them have. I mean, it is a very difficult and it's a very challenging issue for all of the institutions. I expect I probably will get complaints, and indeed have got complaints in relation to whistleblowing, and it's something that I imagine will be part of my workload over the next few years.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Mihai Lisetsky, Romania. First of all, short comment. Open government, it's a process aiming to improve public governance. Let's put it this way. In this respect, open government partnership, it's one approach, starting Obama 2011, everybody knows. But in the same time, there would be some other approaches like the European White Paper on Good Governance. So good governance and open government, there would be 2 attempts, 2 processes aiming to the same, having the same aim, to improve public governance. In this respect, one of the questions would be, how can we, which would be the connection between the 2 of them, considering the fact that while open government process has a very clear methodology about how to be implemented in practice, while the European white paper on good governance, the European so-called approach, it's more or less just a document, quite old already, but it seems that it's no attempt to create an operational methodology for implementation of this white paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Il y a une autre question ici. Là, monsieur avec la veste marron. Non, c'est là. Là.
Merci. Anthony Zahajewski from the Democratic Society. One of the things that I think that worries me a little bit about dividing the transparency agenda from participation and from accountability is that if those don't move in parallel, transparency risks giving more ammunition to populists and anti-institutional voices because it hasn't gone along with the opening up and the shift to citizen control that Brexit and other votes have been showing. So I wonder whether there are ways in which the organisations that are on the stage and the organisations in this room can work better together to move all of those agendas forward, because it feels to me someone who runs something called the Democratic Society, that participation is both harder but also less advanced in the European Union institutions than it is in the member states.
It's a very important point, and in a way, it's the last point I wanted to address. And you're putting it very well. I mean, can transparency without the proper democratic legitimacy actually undermine the legitimacy of institutions? I mean, that's an important question. But don't forget the other one. You want to start?
Oui, transparence et intégrité sont liées de manière indissociable. Ça n'est pas un objectif en soi que d'avoir une société plus transparente. Quel est l'objectif? L'objectif, c'est que les acteurs publics, les acteurs privés adoptent de bons comportements, de bonnes pratiques dans la vie publique, dans la vie économique, dans la société. Donc vous avez complètement raison. Open governance et good governance sont liés de manière indissociable. Je suis complètement d'accord avec vous. Sur la question que vous posez, monsieur, nous pensons, et je ne suis pas le seul à le dire, dans les sociétés très informées et éduquées qui sont les nôtres en Europe, la redevabilité, la transparence est une condition de la confiance des citoyens dans ceux qui exercent un mandat public ou une charge publique. Voilà. Parce qu'on considère les citoyens comme adultes, responsables, et donc il faut leur donner les éléments d'information. Hein. Bon. Mais vous avez raison, la transparence, dans un premier temps, peut avoir un effet inverse. Alimenter le discours sur tous les dirigeants sont pourris. Ce que nous combattons. Nous combattons. Le pacte social, le pacte de confiance suppose, oui, une relation de confiance entre gouvernants et gouvernés, et le fait que, pour moi, l'open government, ça n'est pas le contraire de la démocratie représentative. Les deux doivent se compléter et s'enrichir l'une l'autre.
Merci.
Yes, I think that the question you posed is very interesting, because sometimes, or very often, I hear the pushback about when I'm trying to encourage more transparency is that, well, it's just used to, we are transparent, and where does it get us? And very often I see my own work mediated in a particular way, which leads to EU bashing. But I think you're right that the bit of the circle that hasn't been filled in is that piece where the citizens can actually do something with this information and bring it all back. I was very struck by Samantha Power's contribution yesterday. I don't know whether you heard it or not. So she's the President Obama's ambassador to the UN. And I have to say, I felt sorry for her. I didn't speak to her, but I just was imagining how she must be feeling at the end of all of these years, and to see what's about to happen, or is already happening in Washington. And I think even though she was trying to be upbeat about this agenda, I think part of her, as I understood it, was saying, well, we've done all this, and where has it got us now? I mean, I'm sort of slightly exaggerating what she was saying, but I think she was possibly also signalling what you're signalling. You know, when we have this transparency, what are we doing with it? How are we connecting the citizens with it? And how are we enabling the citizens to deal with it? But earlier this morning, I was speaking to some people from the OGP, and they were telling me about an example that had come from Italy, where funds that had been given to southern Italy in order to develop it in a way that didn't allow it to be certain infrastructural projects and so on to be controlled by the mafia, people weren't really aware of where this money was going. And as I understood what happened, that citizens were enabled from various data flows from audit agencies and so on to see where the money was going and to reflect back to their local government or whatever government, national government, what actually was happening to the money. And things got better as a result of that. They were made more transparent, and the citizens were enabled to take control of this money, which had been sent to them to improve the quality of their lives. So I think that is the great challenge for the OGP, and I think it's also the way perhaps to encourage the Commission to get involved when they see, as somebody put it, what was the word that was used this morning? A value proposal, or yes, when they begin to see the value to citizens that work can do. I think it's a pity that the Commission isn't here these few days. I wrote to the Vice President Timmermans, who would be, that's the rule of law and administration is under his control. He raised various reasons as to why they didn't want to get involved, from legal and so on. But I think it would be a great pity if the Commission didn't get involved, and I think it is vital for them to get involved, however that is done, particularly at a time when citizen distrust and lack of trust is causing such problems for the EU generally. And I think if they can be persuaded to connect the dots between participation in the OGP at whatever level and an improvement of the situation within the EU, then I think it'll probably happen.
Merci. On pourrait rester très longtemps sur cette question, mais je ne voudrais pas qu'on oublie la troisième, qui a trait à la participation des citoyens à travers différentes médiations ou de manière directe, c'est-à-dire à travers les médiations traditionnelles de la société civile, des ONG, mais aussi à travers des méthodes plus directes d'association des citoyens au processus de décision. La question qui se pose, je pense, aujourd'hui, et ça fait la connexion avec la grande question que je posais au départ, c'est, au fond, multiplier les processus de consultation et d'association. Est-ce que ce n'est pas parler toujours à une certaine fraction de nos sociétés, en laissant de côté toute une fraction qui, d'une certaine manière, se sentira d'autant plus en dehors car on aura l'impression qu'elle n'est pas associée à ces processus de consultation. Est-ce que, au fond, dans ce travail important, qui a été négligé pendant un certain temps dans le cadre de l'Union européenne, dans lequel, notamment vis-à-vis des partenaires sociaux, qui n'étaient plus du tout associés, est-ce que, au fond, de faire plus, c'est faire mieux, ou est-ce que c'est, d'une certaine manière, se donner l'impression qu'on associe des acteurs alors qu'on en laisse toute une partie de côté, ou en tout cas on laisse une partie des citoyens de côté? Qui est-ce qui veut se commencer là-dessus, Daniel?
L'Union européenne fait quelque chose de très bien, de mon point de vue, et dont nos États européens pourraient s'inspirer davantage, en tout cas dans le cas de la France, davantage. C'est le processus de consultation ouverte avant toute discussion et adoption de projets de directive, projets de recommandation. Il y a toujours une phase de consultation ouverte, green papers ou autres, hearings. Ça, c'est bien. C'est bien. Parce que dans beaucoup de nos pays, on a des gouvernements ou des parlements qui font la règle, la loi, sans prendre toujours le temps de se mettre à l'écoute de la société et des citoyens. Donc ça, c'est une bonne initiative qui a été prise depuis plusieurs années déjà au niveau de l'Union européenne. Mais quand on regarde comment se déroulent ces consultations, pour rejoindre ce que tu disais à l'instant, Jean, la consultation, c'est l'occasion de recueillir les réactions, les propositions des corps intermédiaires, des organisations professionnelles ou autres qui sont directement concernés par tel ou tel projet. En revanche, il faut le reconnaître, les citoyens européens, les millions de citoyens de l'Europe, s'exprime peu dans le cadre de ces consultations. Donc là, je ne peux pas aller plus loin, mais il y a matière à réfléchir comment prendre l'avis des citoyens de manière ouverte, large, en évitant que les acteurs organisés de la société civile, les entreprises, les syndicats, les grandes ONG monopolisent le débat, le dialogue par rapport aux citoyens. Ça, il y a un vrai sujet. Deuxième axe, le droit de pétition. Alors, je ne sais pas si vous le savez, moi je ne le savais pas jusqu'à une date récente. Le droit de pétition existe en Europe. Citizen Initiative, 1 million de citoyens européens peuvent signer une pétition ouverte sur tout sujet et demander au Parlement ou à la Commission de s'en saisir. Ce droit est très peu utilisé pour l'instant, très peu. Or, je pense que le droit de pétition peut être, parmi d'autres, un bon outil pour les citoyens, le grand public, de donner son avis, de faire des propositions, des suggestions également. Je donne un ou deux exemples qui sont dans l'actualité. Je termine. Est-ce que sur le sujet des OGM, qui est un sujet très difficile, très complexe, est-ce que ça ne vaudrait pas la peine, à partir d'un rapport d'experts, de prendre l'avis des citoyens de l'Europe? Même chose sur les lanceurs d'alerte et la protection des lanceurs d'alerte. Il y a d'ailleurs une pétition signée par plusieurs dizaines et même centaines de milliers de personnes. Réhabiliter le droit de pétition à l'anglaise. Ce ne sont pas les citoyens qui font la loi directement, comme à Athènes, non. Mais ils disent, sur tel sujet, nous souhaitons qu'il y ait un débat au Parlement européen, et un débat ouvert, un débat public, parce que c'est un sujet qui le mérite. Voilà.
Merci. Just a second. I want to follow up on that. In all the complaints you receive from various quarters, I mean, do you have the feeling that they represent sort of biased or unbiased sample of what citizens really care about? I mean, or to put it more directly, when the UK citizen voted against membership in the EU, is it something you receive somehow advance warning of?
Well, I think citizens' concerns are generally around how their member state governments treat them. And the vast majority of the complaints we get from citizens, we actually send back to the member states or to agencies that can deal with them, because they're outside of my mandate, which is the European Union institutions, though we do help everybody that comes to us. I think member state ombudsmen are ones who deal with the bread and butter of people's lives. But I think the point that was being made is very important, particularly in relation to the OGP, and that we're doing the stuff that the OGP is doing, dealing with the issues that actually matter. There was a very interesting intervention this morning from a gentleman representing a UK NGO called Involve. And he was making that point, and he was saying people want to control their lives, want to feel power over their lives and their immediate environment, that there are good schools to send their children to, that there are good hospitals, that they will be looked after. They don't care about a lot of what they would see as the abstract issues that are dealt with very often at European Union
Migration?
level. Yeah. Pardon me?
Migration, free movement?
Migration?
They don't care about it?
Yeah, no, of course they do. Yes, of course they do. But I mean, I'm talking about in their ordinary day-to-day lives, when they want to get up in the morning, feel they have a job to go to, that their children can go and have a good education, and so on and so forth. Migration migration is, of course, a huge issue. I was in Madrid last week, and I was at a meeting of various NGOs, and I say about 85% of the questions that I had related to migration, so people do care about that. They were caring about it on the caring level as opposed to can we stop this level. But just in relation to the ECI, the European Citizens Initiative, unfortunately, people have tried to engage with that, and there have been many millions of people who have engaged with it and who have submitted proposals to the Commission, none of which to date have been taken up. Now, I'm not saying that the Commission should have accepted any particular one of them, but I mean, I think people will begin to think that Europe isn't particularly serious about this type of citizen engagement if one of them isn't successful very shortly.
Thank you. Une question très rapide ici, et puis on va s'acheminer vers la conclusion.
Yes, more of a comment than a question. My name is Martin Ohritsky, and I work for the European Commission Transparency Unit, which is in charge of the Transparency Register. So let me reassure you that even if unfortunately the European Commission is not represented at the round table today, it is represented in the audience, and I will feed back the discussions of this very useful day to my hierarchy back home, also in light of possible future association with the Open Government Partnership Initiative, because we did have a seminar a couple of weeks ago in Brussels hosted by OGP, where we did discuss possible participation of the European Union, or at least a part of the European Union, in OGP, and some potential benefits around that were identified. So all that is being explored. But I wanted to comment briefly on 4 things that you mentioned at the start of the debate. Meetings, publications, so the publication of lobby meetings, the transparency register, open data, and public consultations.
So can you come to the question? We're very short.
I have no question, I'm afraid. I wanted to make a comment in relation to what you were saying about these 4 aspects that are within the competence of the European Commission. If there is no space to do it now, no problem. We can also take it up bilaterally.
Sorry, but I'm looking at the watch, and there are only 3 minutes left. And I want to give the opportunity to our 2 panelists to make a final point. Perhaps on the relationship between this broader issue of dissatisfaction, disenchantment with the EU and what we're discussing here, what would be sort of your key point you would wish to put forward as a proposal or as a direction to follow?
Well, I've said it a few times in recent weeks that, and I'm speaking about the EU and member state countries as well, as they look upon the fallout of Brexit and also the fallout of the US presidential election, which is going to affect all of us, that they need to join the dots between what they're doing politically and administratively, whether at EU level or at member state level, and this populism which has become quite contagious. I think the EU, in fairness to it, is trying to connect and is trying through its various proposals in relation to transparency and so on to make that connection between what it does in the institutional level and the citizens. But I think we all have to recognise that citizen trust is going to increase only when economic and other policies are put in place that reassure people that their quality of life can be improved and the quality of life for their children. Because in certain EU member states we have, for example, very high levels of youth unemployment, people in their 50s and 60s who feel that they are simply now out of the job market because of globalization and for other reasons. And as I can't remember which American president put it many years ago, it's the economy, stupid, and I think it is still the economy. But of course, the issues that we're dealing with can enable governments to do that much more effectively.
C'est tout de même extraordinaire ce que vous nous dites, puisque on parle processus, on parle de transparence, on parle d'association des citoyens, mais à la fin, vous nous dites ce qui compte, c'est le output legitimacy, comme disent les spécialistes. Daniel Lebègue.
La démocratie est un des principes fondateurs de l'Union européenne. Donc, si on croit à l'Union européenne, au projet européen, on doit livrer la bataille et gagner la bataille de la démocratie, tout simplement, autour des axes qu'on a indiqués: transparence des institutions, des acteurs de la vie publique, participation des citoyens aux décisions, aux discussions qui les concernent au premier chef. C'est d'eux dont il s'agit. Donc tout ce qui favorise une appropriation des enjeux de l'Europe, des politiques de l'Europe, va dans le sens d'un renforcement, d'une régénération de la démocratie au niveau de Bruxelles et au niveau de chacun de nos pays, de nos États.
Vous apprécierez l'exactitude avec laquelle nous terminons cette session. Comme j'ai peur que le signal se remette à sonner, je pense qu'il faut s'arrêter là. Je voudrais remercier nos deux intervenants, je voudrais remercier l'ensemble de ceux qui ont participé et vous dire qu'évidemment, cette discussion, cet échange, cette réflexion ne s'arrête pas là, puisque nous avons pris un grand sujet et nous l'avons effleuré.